So in this lecture, which is part two of chapter 8, we've already gone over a lot of things about Constantine and earlier art forms and the basis of sort of the Judeo-Christian worldview that had been forming in the Roman Empire and was especially changing because of this man here, Constantine, who made Christianity legal in 313 with the Edict of Milan. Well, once he made Christianity legal, he also, we talked about, moved the capital to modern day Istanbul, which is he renamed Constantinople after himself. And we talked about the reasons why he did that. And then we want to look at today architecture in this early Christian era. And this legalization of Christianity, it was no longer outlawed, and they did not have to meet in houses any longer, or at times they had met in the catacombs. They could now meet in public places, and it thus necessitated new forms of architecture. This is a building that no longer exists, but was there for a very long time. It has been replaced now by a new St. Peter's, which is in the same spot in Rome, in the Vatican. The original was commissioned by Constantine. It was made of stone, brick, and wood, and you can see that it has a long floor plan that would be called longitudinal. What I mean by that is if you come into the building through this big courtyard called the atrium into this area called the narthex, which was basically like a big entry hall, you could imagine. And then when you go in the doors, you could see all the way up this main central aisle called the nave to the apse, which was where the service would happen with the priest and the Eucharist, which is the bread and wine, often called communion, in a service representing Christ's blood and body. Depending on the theological bent of the church, could also be taking the body and blood of Christ, and which is something that's practiced today, even, right, in churches. And this would be all happening here at the apse, the focal point of the service and the building, this semicircular niche back here. And this crossing section is kind of unique to this building, called a transept. You can see it from the side view here, that this is what I'm talking about, the transept right there. So if you look straight down it, there's also aisles on each side to accommodate more people, and there may have been even a some sort of fountain in the atrium. Atrium's an interesting word because we talked about that being the main big open room in the houses in Pompeii. So this whole style of building was based upon the Roman basilica layout, because when the early Christians were thinking about styles of architecture, they did not want to base their buildings upon earlier types of architecture that were related to shrines and temples for polytheistic religion, the old Roman religion. And also those type of buildings did not have the same wide spaces inside of them to accommodate so many people. This building could accommodate up to about 4,000 people and was based on the Roman basilica layout. This is an example of a basilica that was made by Constantine, and this is the ruins of it. You can see how the apses are there, and it's a wide building. Well, this is another version of it in Trier in Germany, and you can see that this one has already been transformed into a church, and you can see how it relates perfectly to what we're talking about with Old St. Peter's, even so far as to the wooden ceiling inside of this, which Old St. Peter's would have also had. And you can see how from the beginning of the building, from the doorway after you enter the narthex, all the way down the whole central aisle, you could see the table where the Eucharist is right up there in this building that still exists today. It would have been the same in Old St. Peter's, which we're talking about. So those are just some examples of buildings that still exist in modern day. So what were these buildings, basilicas, that they were based upon? Well, those were actually Roman law courts. And I think that we could say in this there was a purposeful choice beyond it being a good style to accommodate a lot of people, that it would be a type of symbolism to pick courts or court type architecture, because um, a lot of the sort of ideas about Christ's sacrifice, being that he died to reunite people to God and to get rid of the sin that they had done, has legal ideas behind it. So this is a purposeful act, I think a lot of people would say, in that regard to pick a type of architecture that meets with that or brings those ideas into it. So we've looked at the kind of different parts and pieces you're supposed to be able to understand. Atrium, narthex, also called the vestibule sometimes, the side aisles, the nave, the transept, and the apse. Those are important pieces for you to understand what they are. We'll later on in chapters that continue on from here see that this transept crossing becomes something that goes across the middle of the church, so that when you end up being able to see it from the air, it would look like a cross. It's called a Latin style cross. Right now, we haven't seen any of those yet, and so this is kind of a rare thing during this time period. You don't get as many transepts in the buildings. It had a flat timber ceiling, and these windows here are called clerestory windows, high up in the air, to let in a lot of light into the building, because we have to remember we're talking about a time when there wasn't electricity. We kind of forget that sometimes. I mean, we just get so caught up in our modern way of thinking and living in the world that we kind of forget what they were dealing with. And so having really high windows let in a lot of extra light, because if you want to light a whole room, you put the light up higher in the room, right? In the ceiling, if you put a light on the ceiling, you can illuminate more of the room. Well, the same idea here with the clerestory windows. It was built over the site of the supposed site of St. Peter, the Apostle Peter's grave. And so the modern day New St. Peter's is also over that. Originally, this transept at this time with Old St. Peter's, I don't know about New St. Peter's, held some relics from Peter, which are things, or that a relic is a item that was owned, or even a piece of a person, like their bones or body of a holy person, a religious person. We'll see a lot of these in the next chapters become quite a thing. There's a veneration of saints, and so relics become very important. This is a comparison to that basilica, so you can understand how there was an influence between the two and how it changed. It would have been very ornately decorated. Interior, especially on the interior. The exterior would have been very plain and simple, like the Trier German one that still exists. This is an artist's rendering, but yeah, it would have had really, really complex, beautiful, ornate things, and even things such as like a basilica would have had. There's a list of things in your book that Constantine gave to them when they first started using the building, including like gold dishes and candelabras and candles and all kinds of beautiful things for the table where the Eucharist was served, So it was really, really, I'm sure, really, really ornate and full of all kinds of riches and wealth. Part of the reason they wanted to rebuild it was this flat ceiling roof of timber was prone to being able to catch on fire, so that's part of it, but also they wanted to make something more grand, I'm sure. This is probably how it looked. This is a rendering, a drawing from the Renaissance before it was torn down. That was when it was remade. So you can see the baptistry fountain where you enter. It was one of the more grand buildings that churches in the early times of early Christian art. This type of plan, this basilica plan, is still used in some churches today, and you will see it used in other churches in the chapter, but usually there's not an atrium, and other churches in the chapter don't often have a transept either. This is an example of a building that kind of shows you the type of possible decoration style and how ornate it would have been on the inside of Old St. Peter's. This is called St. Paul outside the walls, and it still exists. This one doesn't have a wooden ceiling like the other one would have done, but you can see the kind of use of things like Corinthian columns from Greek, all the way back from the Greek era, and this rhythm and this beautiful marble work. So you can get a sort of idea of how amazing of a building it probably was. Why are we talking about a building that doesn't exist at this point, you might be thinking? Well, it's because it's sort of the first type of this, the one that they picked the rest of them to be modeled after for quite a long time. And so because of that, it's really important. And that's why we're still talking about it all this time later, even though it doesn't exist any longer. St. Peter's as it is today is still quite old, really, called New St. Peter's, but still very old. The older one was ready to collapse, so it was taken down, and a new one was built on the same site during the Renaissance. It's the main Roman Catholic church in the Vatican, and Peter was said to be the first pope by Roman Catholics, and so the lineage of popes continues on till today. And that's partially why it's an important site for it to be over his grave as the first bishop or pope of Rome. Okay, moving on to another important church. This is the interior of St. Costanza. We're going to look also at some of these mosaics up here that are really beautiful. You can see from this that on the ground plan that I'll show you next, that it's a totally different style of church. It's not longitudinal, it's a circular sort of form. This probably was originally a mausoleum, which is to house a tomb or tombs sometimes, but this one, a singular one, which was Constantine's daughter, and then was later transformed into a church. There's a lot of these that were found by big basilica-style churches. They would build these around, sometimes to be baptistries where people would be baptized. We talked about baptism in lecture 1. Also as mausoleums. This one's pretty unique in that it has double pillars, 12 sets, so 24 pillars. Again, we see the Corinthian columns used throughout it, and these kind of beautiful arches, and creating this domed space. So central plans are round or polygonal. The parts are usually equal or almost equal. You can see this one's pretty round. And this is called the ambulatory, where all those mosaics are. It was pretty plain outside as well, just like we talked about with St. Peter's, but richly decorated on the inside. It has a lot of interesting symbolism inside of it, because you can see in the decorations we'll see a lot of symbolism. Besides that, there's a symbolism of light, kind of being like God's presence. We'll talk about this in continuing chapters. Roundness being something to do with the idea of eternity, and circular space being grand. We could think about this in terms of other types of domed buildings we've talked about already, like the Tholos tombs way back in Mycenaean era, and this being originally a type of burial place. That kind of makes sense in a way. And then we have things like the Pantheon from Rome being a domed space. And the things that are happening in that space are ideas of heavens, the heavens lifting up, the circular space like the dome of the sky of the heavens. So a lot of those same type of things are really happening here. Um, Interesting, we have to talk about a method or material that we haven't talked a lot about, which is using mosaics in early Christian period, and it continues on in Byzantine too. And so you want to be able to understand that, what a mosaic is, and also the architectural terminology we talked about before with the apse, and all those type of terms I just said to you about the basilica plan churches, okay? These are details of the mosaics. And a mosaic, in essence, is small pieces of tile, glass, or stone arranged and embedded in concrete. Been used for a really long time. A lot of times, glass ones, they were. Your book has a whole section. You should read about it. You should be reading your book called Tesserae, arranged in groupings of 4. And they used a lot of glass because it highlighted and reflected light, and that would be catch the eye, would be visually interesting, and again, reflection and light being the ideas of God's presence and grandeur as well, being a part of that. So we can see here in the middle of it a bunch of little cherub type of guys, and they're called putti, and they are like little cupids that are associated with, in this, Bacchus, who is the god of wine and also theater. And these are like Bacchic rites. These little guys, these winged cherubs, are harvesting grapes and making wine. And so this is an interesting combination, really, because we have the old Roman religion with the gods meeting into this place that's a burial for a Christian, became a church as well. There's ideas here that people suggest that this is purposeful because in the Eucharist, which is served in church services a lot of times, especially maybe Roman Catholic churches or Episcopalian, Anglican type of churches, every service, sometimes in other churches, not every service. There's the idea of the blood of Christ being like wine, and so there's a connection in that way, possibly, for them. There's also these bust portraits. This is one here of Constantine's daughter, and her husband is also located in here, in another one. There's a little bit of a question as to how accurate that is to be for sure his daughter, because it's been so heavily restored, but that's the sort of general consensus that this is her, because this was a mausoleum for her tomb. So we see this is looking up at the ceiling in this ambulatory space right here, this like big donut shape around the center, which allows people to see, and all these niches would allow for, statuary, different things. And now as a church allows people to be part of the service, see the service from all around. Just like you have theaters that you can see from, the front, which was common. Now we all are in the audience looking on the stage. Well, there also used to be theaters in the round. Well, this could kind of be that type of same analogy or difference between the other church, which everything is pointed towards longitudinally, and this is more of a round shaped building, transformed into a church. But we will see churches that are specifically designed to be in this shape, especially in the Byzantine Empire, and they take it to a really grand scale. So that's pretty interesting. Coming up in the next chapter 9. We're going to look at now some different mediums that are a bit different than painting and sculpture and architecture, often called the luxury arts, but sometimes you'll hear them referred to as minor arts. Not because they're unimportant, but because they're smaller in scale. Usually they have different type of functionalities to them. Oftentimes you'll see things like we looked at before, Nestor's cup, the Rhyton vessel from the Persians. Well, there's a long history of silver and gold and very finely wrought dishes made out of like expensive materials like silver and gold. And this one has an interesting narrative. It was found in Mildenhall, England, which is far away from Rome, and it's kind of interesting to think about something that's like Roman or early Christian being found this far away. But if you remember from last chapter, we talked about how the Roman Empire stretched all the way up to almost to Scotland, right? Hadrian's Wall between Scotland and England. And so there are plenty of Roman things even in England. And if you go to England in modern day, you can go to the town of Bath, which is named after the Roman baths, and they're pretty interesting. And so there's all kinds of architecture even in England. Well, this was found by a farmer plowing his field in 1942, and pretty crazy that it was a great find, and it was immediately called the Mildenhead Hall treasure. And this is one of, I think, 36, if I remember, different pieces of silverware and bowls and dishes. There were spoons and things. Well, this one has a scene with, in the middle, a bearded god who was Oceanus. He's in the middle, and he's framed by sea nymphs around him. You can see them all here. And then on the outside is another sort of interesting narratives that are happening with sea nymphs and things like that. And we have right over here Bacchus and Hercules having a drinking contest. So it's pretty interesting, but they're having, Bacchus, the god of wine. We're seeing a lot of him in this chapter on different things. He's trying to be out drunk by Hercules, but Hercules is becoming so drunk that he can barely stand, so he's being supported by two satyrs. So pretty obvious symbolism here of eating and drinking and being on vessels, so it's pretty clear why they might choose that. It's interesting with the sea and the nymphs and things too. I mean, fish come from the sea. There's the idea of bounty coming from the ocean and sea. So it's not like a big surprise why they would use this. What's interesting though is from the era that it's in, that there's still happening a combination of older narratives around the old gods and classical ideas mixing in still. And so we'll see that happening in different pieces in this era as well. Because some of the other dinnerware had symbols on it for Cairo, which is the first two letters of Christ's name. So there was a kind of strange mixing in this treasure, the combination of all the treasure between older narratives and then Christian narratives as well. So we're seeing that kind of happening in different pieces, like the ceiling of the mausoleum. Same type of ideas where it's kind of a slippage back and forth still happening. This piece is the oldest known, or existent, I should say. It's from the oldest known book, the Vatican Virgil. That's the oldest existent book in either Greek or Latin. I couldn't get that out. That means it's the oldest one that's still around in either of those languages. It was made, it's from a codex, which is a new sort of form at this time, and in replacing scrolls, they're going to codexes, which are early forms of books, basically made out of calfskin or lambskin, which would be called vellum when it's calfskin, and parchment when it's lambskin. And this is painted on the lambskin, the parchment. It's an extensive process because you had to skin the animal, cure the skin, get it into the sheets, lay it out for lettering, letter it with all the writing, paint it with imagery, and then add gold leafing a lot of the time to each of them, then bind all the pages together, and then cover them, oftentimes with like ornate jewel metal type of covers with jewels and precious metals. And this whole art form of painting in books and making them, beautified is called illumination, illuminating manuscripts. Most often you get this in the future with gospel books and hymnals and things like that, but this is a form that also extended here into Virgil's poetry. So Virgil is a poet, an important poet from this time period back in the classical era. And in this part, he's visiting a farmer, and this is the farmer here, and this is his rustic farmhouse. This is a common theme in Latin poetry and the farmer's talking about the joy and beauty of simple life, and he's talking to two farmhands and then also Virgil, who's disguised as a farmhand. You can see in some way the subtlety of the landscape. It's done in tempera, which was egg with pigment, egg yolk and white mixed together with pigment. That mostly white with a little yolk, I should say, where it's like a simplistic sort of landscape that you could kind of relate in ways to the Pompeii wall paintings, like the third and fourth style of Roman painting. So it's bordered around with this darker red and black to be almost like a frame within the book, like you're looking on a scene, or you're looking in on this window, into this window. And it has a sort of crudeness to it that is in the painting that's purposeful to talk about the simple idea and matches the style. I think you should just want to point out to you that books in this time are super rare and not everyone reads, right? Not like now the rate of literacy in the world today, the modern world, is so high compared to this time period, 400 to 420 AD. And so there's no printing presses. Books are super rare and expensive and luxury items to own and to have. And so people took very good care of them, but also they illuminated them and made them really, really, made them with a high degree of craftsmanship, because if they were going to bother to write it all out by hand, they were going to make it beautiful as well. Could you imagine if you had to write out all your textbooks by hand? Just think about that. So another form of art that we see going back for a really long time is ivory carving. And I think it's easy to forget about the previous chapters when we're looking at the current chapter. But if you remember, we looked at some things even from way back, way, way back in the prehistoric era, that were carvings of ivory. And so this is from the side of a box, a plaque, and this is a common use for ivory in this time period for box covers and chest covers and for plaques. And then also we'll see some for things that are called diptychs. This is one plaque on a series of plaques and some of the oldest passion scenes constructed. If you look in your book, and you should have been reading it by now, there's a whole page about the Passion, which is the events leading up to Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, but his crucifixion. This is, as told in the Bible, this is a scene that comes where Judas is hanging himself over here, and these are the 30 pieces of silver below him that he was paid to betray Christ. And then to his left is Mary, the Virgin Mary, his mother, the mother of Jesus, and Joseph of Arimathea, who was the part of the Jewish ruling council, who took him when he was taken down off the cross. He buried him in a new tomb. And then to the right there is the Roman soldier who is piercing Jesus with this in the side with a spear. So he is given the name in your book of Longinus, which is interesting. I don't think anyone knows who the name of that person who was pierced the side with a spear was, but that's what they said. So this is the third in the panel of these that are showing the passion. So the first ones show Pilate washing his hands of the whole trial and saying, "Do with him what you will, but I'm not going to be part of it." And Jesus carrying his cross up to the Golgotha, the hill where he was crucified, and also shows the denial of Peter, the same Peter of who St. Peter's is named after, that he denied Christ 3 times. That's the first one. Then that was all in one panel. And then there was this one, and then later on there's one of doubting Thomas. No, sorry, the third one, this is the second. The third one is the 2 Marys and 2 soldiers at the door of an empty tomb with an empty coffin. And then the fourth one is doubting Thomas, the apostle, disciple of Jesus, who didn't believe he had risen from the dead until he saw the risen Christ and he's touching his wounds. So it's one of a whole series, really, really beautifully carved by the same sculptor, out of ivory. Ivory was a really, and still is, a sought after material because it's rare, only found mostly found in Africa, on elephant tusks, and today is illegal to be harvested because they kill the elephants, which is pretty atrocious if you ever watch a video about it. But it was also rare and valued because it took really skilled craftsmen to work with it and to make it do what they wanted it to do. It's also admired for its beauty, and its white color, and of course its exotic origins. It's hard to get, so things that are not as easy to procure, and there isn't as much of it, like gold, and they're beautiful, are often valued, and this is an example of that. Stylistically, I think we can see some really interesting things. It's a relief carving. It's attached to its back, and there's quite a bit of undercutting. They've reattached some pieces here, you can see. And we have this kind of juxtaposition between the disciple who rejected and betrayed Jesus, and he's hanging, and then the Savior, Christ, it says King of the Jews above his head, being hung on a cross. He's a little higher, but still at one tree and another tree. And then these people looking away. There's quite an emotional quality to this, and the 2 important figures here. But it has a really fluid motion throughout it, in the way that the motion and movement in their cloaks move and draw our eye throughout the piece. It's very beautiful craftsmanship. So I think it's a great example of an early Passion series, and this is probably the most important. I shouldn't say most important. It's the panel with the biggest scene of action, the crucifixion. So that takes us through that piece. We have another piece of that's part of a diptych, which also would be out of the same material. And I said that sometimes they would make diptychs out of ivory as well. Well, this is one, and diptych means 2 panels. You can do diptych paintings or triptychs. It means you have 2 paintings that go together. Well, at this time, the diptychs were particularly designed for official or ceremonial and official purposes, like to announce important things. There were a pair of hinged tablets, so they would be connected together with hinges. This one is either for a marriage or the passing of an important family member. It's interesting. This name up here is the family name up at the top. And it's got a woman sacrificing at an altar, and she has an attendant helping her celebrate probably the rites of Bacchus. It has really fluid lines throughout it, and it's really beautifully carved. You can see this is like the altar outside. That's why they think Bacchus, and it's got this patterning like a fleur-de-lis all around it. You can see that she has a classical look to her. If you compare her to other classical sculptures and things, she has the same vibe and feeling. Pretty naturalistic. Not a lot of deep space, but just a simplistic background and an attendant. She's bigger, so she's more important. The attendant is smaller. We have all that type of stuff going on. But you have that beautiful line work inside of the robes that she's wearing. Very graceful, fluid line. There's a little bit more symbolism as well. There's ivy in her hair, so that's part of the idea of a Bacchic rite, and she's in the open air. There's a sort of what people would say about this, a spiritual serenity to this, and it draws deeply upon the classical tradition that man is the measure of all things, to idealize human beauty as being something to attain to. This is definitely happening in this piece, so I think it's an interesting work, and if you see it compared to this Suicide of Judas, the way that the figures are treated this is a different feeling to it, a lot not rougher in its craftsmanship, but maybe the subject matter is more intense, and it does have more of a blocky. The figures feel more substantial and they're more in the round, even though they're connected to the background. This is more not as deep of relief and more of a drawing sensibility to it. We're going to look at another piece of architecture for a minute here. This is the interior of Santa Sabina. It's a basilica-style Constantine church. You can see, again, just how it had a central nave and side aisles, and here's the apse at the front where the Eucharist is served. It has these Corinthian columns that go up it. And I want to point out with this picture how the rhythm of the columns draws your eye from the doorway all the way up to the apse, not to mention the clerestory windows and the light shining in, and then all the decoration in the apse draws your eye as well. This piece is pretty amazing because it's still original to the 422, 433 date. It's still standing and original, so it gives us somewhat of another idea of how old St. Peter's may have looked. And it has things like the original doors made out of cypress wood carved that are part of it. So thinking about something that's wood surviving for thousands of years, we're talking about a really long time, 432 AD. 1,000 years is still 1432, which is still a long time ago, and it's wood. So, it was able to preserve because it's a part of an important building. One of these little panels, we're just looking at a tiny little panel and kind of show you the kind of detail in all this work that they had here, this craftsmanship, shows you like the scroll work, the beautiful like feeling of scroll work, and the kind of vegetal material. Well, in here is the crucifixion, so Christ being crucified between two thieves. So this is just to show you kind of the type of level of detail and craftsmanship in this building. The outside of this would be plain, just like the rest of these basilica buildings we've looked at, and very pretty much unadorned brick, basic. There's some feeling of ordination in the windows, but not really. And the interior being the main focus, where the service is held and the Eucharist is served, in the style of the building reflecting that idea that the important part is what's happening inside, not how it looks on the outside. So that takes us through this chapter. If you read the book, there's a couple more churches that it'll cover for you, which I'm interested in you hearing about and reading about. As I've said to you before, my purpose in this whole lecturing in this course is not to just go over every piece by piece, but to point things out and draw things out for you that you wouldn't necessarily get just by reading the book and giving you examples and showing you contrasting things. So continue to read the whole chapter, and you're going to want to do a written response question. This is your question: is what was the purpose or purposes of early Christian catacomb art. And I just want you guys to think about, when you do it, I need you, and I say it in the assignment sheet, to pick a particular piece of art to talk about. There's a lot of ones that you could pick, and I think you need to make sure when you're doing this that you really hone in on a piece of work and think through these ideas in your own words and use quotes well. I think I've seen a common problem has been that people haven't been citing page numbers in quotation marks, in parentheses in the work. And so that's been really problematic for your grades, as well as you need to continue to use good grammar and check issues with that. And I suggest you really to have some structure to your piece, think about introduction, your points, and then kind of saying what you said as a sort of way of working on these pieces. All right, guys, take care. I hope you're staying well out there, and I'll talk to you soon.